February 2021. The lights go out across Texas. For millions, the cold isn't just outside anymore. It's inside their homes. Pipes burst. Water stops running. In the energy capital of the world, people are freezing to death in the dark. The official death toll would eventually climb past 200. But the true number is likely far higher. In the aftermath, Americans asked a simple question: how could this happen? The answer they got was both technical and deeply strange. The Texas power grid had failed, but it wasn't just a failure of equipment. It was a failure of isolation. The grid, run by a unique entity called ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is an island. It's intentionally disconnected from the two massive grids that power the rest of the continental United States. When Texas needed help, it couldn't get enough. The cavalry wasn't coming because, by design, there was no road for them to ride on. This is where the real question emerges. Why? Why would a state famous for its energy production deliberately wall itself off? The common answer points to the 1930s, a rebellion against federal regulation, and that's true. But it's not the beginning of the story. It's a symptom of a much deeper cause, a cause buried in the very foundation of Texas itself. To understand why Texas froze in the 21st century, you have to understand a deal it made in the 19th. The modern, federally unregulated Texas power grid exists because of a unique provision in the 1845 Joint Resolution for Annexation. This clause, designed to solve a desperate, 175-year-old debt crisis, allowed Texas to keep its public lands. It was a footnote in a treaty, a financial solution to a forgotten problem. But that footnote enshrined a legal and cultural precedent of state sovereignty so powerful that, a century later, it gave Texas utilities the motive, the means, and the justification to build their own electric Alamo, an intrastate grid built for one reason: to keep the federal government out. This is the story of how a choice made to save a bankrupt republic created the conditions for a 21st century blackout. It's a chain of events, stretching from dusty diplomatic tables in Washington, D.C. to the frozen suburbs of Austin. To unravel this mystery, we have to go back to the beginning, to a Texas that wasn't a powerful state, but a glorious and deeply vulnerable, independent nation. The Republic of Texas was born in a blaze of glory at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836, but by the early 1840s, the glory was gone. All that was left was the blaze, a dumpster fire of debt, diplomatic isolation, and the constant threat of invasion. This was the crisis facing Sam Houston, the larger-than-life hero of the revolution, now serving as president. Houston's problem wasn't a lack of land or pride. It was a lack of cash. The republic was functionally bankrupt, crushed under the weight of a staggering $10 million debt. In today's money, that's billions. For a fledgling nation with a tiny tax base and no real industry, it was a death sentence. Because of this debt, Houston couldn't pay his soldiers, leaving the frontier vulnerable to raids. He couldn't fund a navy, which meant Mexico, a nation that never recognized Texan independence, could blockade its ports at will. He couldn't get loans from European powers, who saw Texas as a high-risk, low-reward investment destined to fail. The Lone Star was alone, and it was flickering. As Houston himself lamented, "We are in a ruinous condition." This is why annexation by the United States wasn't just an option, it was a lifeline. Houston knew his country's only realistic path to survival was to join the Union. But he was a shrewd political operator. He couldn't come to the negotiating table as a beggar. To do so would be to accept whatever scraps Washington offered. He needed leverage. He needed a bargaining chip so valuable that it would force the U.S. to give him the terms he needed. Terms that could solve his nation's crippling debt and secure its future. The survival of Texas depended on finding something to sell. And Texas had only one thing left in abundance: land. Millions and millions of acres of it. Sam Houston's gambit to sell Texas to the United States found a willing buyer in President John Tyler. By 1844, Tyler's administration had negotiated what seemed like a straightforward deal: a treaty of annexation. The plan was conventional. Texas would join the Union, and like every other territory that had become a state, it would cede its public lands to the federal government. In exchange, Washington would assume its crippling $10 million debt. It was a clean, simple trade. But here's the problem. A treaty requires a 2/3 supermajority in the U.S. Senate for ratification. It's designed to be a high bar, forcing broad consensus. And in 1844 America, there was no consensus on the single most explosive issue of the day: Slavery. This is where John C. Calhoun enters the story. As Tyler's Secretary of State, Calhoun was the architect of the treaty, but his goal wasn't just to annex Texas. It was to build what he called an empire for slavery. He was a brilliant but rigid ideologue, and he made a calculated but catastrophic political move. Instead of framing annexation as a matter of national security or economic benefit, Calhoun publicly and explicitly declared that the treaty's primary purpose was to protect and expand the institution of slavery against British abolitionist plots. He put the poison pill right on the label. The effect was immediate and devastating. For Northern senators, this transformed the debate. It was no longer about adding a new state. It was about adding a massive new slave state, tipping the nation's delicate balance of power. The treaty went down in flames. The final vote in June 1844 wasn't even close. 16 in favor, 35 against. A spectacular failure. Because of Calhoun's strategic blunder, the conventional path to statehood was now a political dead end. This humiliation forced annexationists to realize that if they were going to get Texas into the Union, they would have to find another way. A legislative backdoor that bypassed the high wall of a Senate treaty vote. After the treaty's collapse, the Texas question should have been dead. The political establishment in Washington, led by the Whig Party's Henry Clay and the Democrats' Martin Van Buren, agreed on one thing. Annexing Texas was too politically toxic. In the upcoming 1844 presidential election, both frontrunners decided to take the issue off the table, hoping it would simply fade away. But they had fundamentally misread the mood of the country. And one man saw an opportunity in their caution. A little-known Tennessee politician named James K. Polk. Polk was a dark horse candidate, an outsider who nobody expected to win the Democratic nomination, let alone the presidency. Polk's strategy was to ignore the Washington insiders and speak directly to the public's growing ambition. He built his entire campaign around a single, powerful idea: manifest destiny. This was the popular belief that America had a divinely ordained mission to expand across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Polk didn't just promise to annex Texas. He promised to acquire Oregon from the British and California from Mexico. His slogan, 5440 or fight, referring to the Oregon border dispute, captured this aggressive, expansionist spirit. He wasn't offering a complex policy. He was offering a national destiny. The result was a political earthquake. Polk won the election. His narrow victory was interpreted by everyone in Washington as a direct mandate from the American people. The voters hadn't chosen a cautious manager. They had chosen an expansionist. This is why the election was so consequential. It created an overwhelming political momentum that could no longer be ignored. The people had spoken, and they wanted Texas. Because of Polk's victory, the failed treaty was no longer the end of the story. Instead, it was the beginning of a frantic, last-ditch effort by the outgoing President Tyler and his allies in Congress to honor this new mandate and annex Texas by any means necessary. They now had the political cover to try something radical. Because of Polk's victory, the political calculus in Washington had completely flipped. The question was no longer if Texas should be annexed, but how to do it before President-elect Polk even took office. Outgoing President John Tyler and his allies saw a chance to secure their legacy. But here was the problem. The treaty route was dead, blocked by a hostile Senate that they couldn't win over. So they devised a calculated workaround. Instead of a treaty, which required a 2/3 supermajority, they would use a joint resolution. Think of it as a legislative loophole. A joint resolution only needed a simple majority in both houses of Congress, a much lower bar to clear. This shift from a treaty to a resolution created a critical opening for the Republic of Texas. Its president, Anson Jones, was a shrewd negotiator. He understood that the frantic rush in Washington gave him immense leverage. Texas wasn't just a prize to be won. It was a sovereign nation with a massive problem: a $10 million debt that had crippled its government for years. Normally, when a new state joined the Union, the federal government would absorb its debts. In exchange, the state would cede its public lands to Washington. It was a clean, standard transaction. But Anson Jones saw a different path. He knew Texas's greatest asset wasn't its cotton fields or its ports. It was its sheer size: millions upon millions of acres of unclaimed land. This is what led to the ultimate bargain. Jones and the Texan diplomats made a counteroffer that was unprecedented in American history. Texas would join the Union, but it would keep all of its public lands. In return, Texas would be solely responsible for paying off its own crippling debt. For the politicians in Washington, desperate to seal the deal, this was a strategically acceptable trade. They got Texas, honored the election mandate, and didn't have to add $10 million to the national debt. In February 1845, Congress passed the joint resolution. This single provision, the public lands provision, was the legal mechanism that would change everything. It was a practical solution to a 19th-century financial crisis, but it enshrined Texas's economic independence into the very terms of its statehood, creating a foundation of sovereignty no other state could claim. This unique deal meant that on the day Texas officially joined the Union, it began its life as a state with a fundamentally different relationship to the federal government. Unlike Ohio or Tennessee, which had handed over their lands, Texas was now in business for itself. It was a state, but it was also a land baron with a colossal balance sheet. Over 200 million acres in assets and millions in liabilities. And this is why the state government immediately had to become something more than a government. It had to become a massive resource management corporation. The new state legislature in Austin wasn't just debating laws. It was forced to become an expert in surveying, land sales, and debt settlement. Their primary job was turning dirt into cash. They had to create a general land office not as a sleepy bureaucracy, but as the financial engine of the entire state. This practical necessity, managing its own resources to pay its own bills, had a profound and lasting cultural effect. For decades, the most important political fights in Texas weren't about federal policy, but about state land policy. It cultivated generations of Texas politicians, lawyers, and businessmen whose entire careers were built on managing Texas resources, completely independent of Washington, D.C. Because of this, a deep-seated culture of self-reliance became encoded into the state's DNA. The default mindset wasn't to ask for a federal program or a federal bailout. It was to look at a map of Texas and figure out how to solve the problem internally. This self-sufficiency wasn't just an attitude. It was a learned behavior, reinforced by decades of financial reality. It naturally fostered a powerful skepticism toward federal authority. When federal agents did show up, the institutional response was often, "Thanks, but we've got this." This isn't just bravado. It's a direct consequence of the 1845 annexation deal. That financial arrangement laid the cultural groundwork that, nearly a century later, would make the idea of an independent, federally unregulated power grid seem not just logical, but natural. For nearly a century, that culture of fierce independence, forged in the financial crucible of annexation, was never truly challenged. Texas managed its land, its oil, and its business with a possessive, almost parental authority. But then came the Great Depression. The crisis was so vast, so total, that it created a force more powerful than any Texas had faced before. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And with it came an entirely new philosophy of government. FDR and his army of ambitious federal administrators didn't see state lines as sacred borders. They saw a national emergency that demanded a national solution. This is why, in 1935, they passed the Federal Power Act. On its face, the goal was simple: regulate the sale of electricity across state lines to prevent price gouging and ensure reliability. To the new dealers in Washington, this was just common sense. Electricity was becoming the lifeblood of the modern economy, and they believed a patchwork of private utilities couldn't be trusted to manage it fairly. They saw themselves as protectors of the public good. But to the utility executives in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, men steeped in that century-old culture of Texas self-reliance, this wasn't protection, it was a declaration of war. They saw the Federal Power Act as an existential threat. It wasn't just about rates or regulations, it was about who was in charge. For generations, Texas had solved its own problems. Now, a man in Washington was telling them how to run their business. These executives believed, correctly, that federal regulation, once invited in, would never leave. It would mean federal bureaucrats setting their prices, dictating their investments, and ultimately, seizing control of the state's economic destiny. To them, the act was a Trojan horse, and because of the unique way their state was founded, they had a cultural and institutional reflex against it that simply didn't exist in the same way in Ohio or Pennsylvania. Their response wasn't just to lobby or complain, it was to look for a way out. The executives at Texas Power and Light, Houston Lighting and Power, and other major utilities saw the trap. But they also saw a loophole. Reading the fine print of the Federal Power Act, their lawyers landed on two critical words: interstate commerce. The law gave Washington authority only over electricity that crossed state lines. So what if their electricity never did? What if they built a self-contained electrical system, an island, that stopped dead at the borders of Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico? It was a radical, strategically audacious plan. It wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a massive engineering challenge. Because of this legal threat, they made a calculated decision. Instead of connecting their growing power plants to the emerging national grids for stability, they did the opposite. They began deliberately weaving their transmission lines together, but only times within times the state. A power line heading for the Louisiana border would stop just short. A connection that could have reached Oklahoma was never built. They created what was called the Texas Interconnected System. Think of it as building your own private highway system and refusing to connect it to the federal interstate. As long as your cars never touch their roads, you don't have to follow their rules. This wasn't an accident of geography. It was a conscious act of corporate secession. They were building an electric Alamo, a self-contained fortress designed to keep the federal regulators out. In 1941, when a generating company in East Texas made a single, tiny connection to a power company in Arkansas to help with the war effort, the feds immediately tried to claim jurisdiction. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The message was received loud and clear: any connection, no matter how small, would cede control. The lines were cut. The fortress walls went back up. This defiant act cemented the grid's isolation, a direct physical consequence of a cultural mindset born 100 years earlier in a debate over public debt and land. This is why, in February 2021, the lights went out. The story of the Texas blackout doesn't begin with a frozen gas well or a stalled wind turbine. It begins in 1845 with a nation-sized accounting problem. The entire, sprawling, defiant, isolated Texas power grid is the modern technological ghost of a bankrupt republic's desperate financial negotiation. It wasn't born from an abstract love of freedom, it was born from a balance sheet. The joint resolution for annexation was the critical domino. Because Sam Houston's republic was drowning in debt, its diplomats negotiated a deal no other state ever received. Texas would keep its public lands to pay its own creditors. This strategic choice, made to solve a 19th-century budget crisis, enshrined a powerful legal and cultural precedent. Texas handles its own affairs. It owns its own house. A century later, when Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration sought to regulate the nation's power, Texas utility executives faced a choice. They could join the national system, gaining stability but ceding control to Washington. Or they could honor that deep-seated precedent of Texas sovereignty. Their decision to build the electric Alamo, an intrastate grid to dodge the Federal Power Act, was a 20th-century echo of that 19th-century bargain. It was a calculated business decision wrapped in the flag of independence. They traded the safety net of interconnection for the freedom of non-regulation. And that reveals the hidden mechanism at the heart of this story. The Texas grid's isolation persists not just because of ideology, but because it is profitable. For decades, this freedom from federal oversight allowed for a market designed to prioritize one thing above all else: the lowest possible price. It worked, until it didn't. The system was engineered for financial efficiency, not for resilience against a once-in-a-century storm. The catastrophic failure was a direct consequence of a system designed to maximize profit by minimizing regulatory burdens. A design made possible only by a unique provision in an annexation treaty signed 175 years earlier. Every system is a set of trade-offs. For generations, Texas traded robust resilience for cheaper electricity and state control. In 2021, the bill for that trade-off finally came due, leaving millions of people to pay the price in the dark and the cold. The story of the Texas grid is a stark reminder that the most consequential decisions in history are often not made on the battlefield, but in the quiet rooms where accountants and lawyers hash out the deals that will echo for centuries. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden causes, and leave a comment. What other modern problems do you think have surprising historical roots?